Hi, everyone. Okay, I am going to get us started, and we will, first of all, say good afternoon to everybody. We're so excited to have you with us. We're going to start off with a few notes, and I know that many of you have heard it before, and bear with me because I know we're still getting some new people. So this session is the fourth in our series of 5 sessions. The sessions are being recorded and will be available afterwards on Facebook and YouTube. And we will also share the links to the recordings and any links to materials that we reference via email to anyone who registered for the Zoom. If you want a copy of any of the materials but you're not registered, just feel free to email me at rpickerneiss@jcrcstl.org and I will get it over to you. This discussion aims to explore the complex features of Jewish peoplehood and the contemporary challenges to Jewish unity. It is not going to be a political discussion about Israel, but a dialogue about what it means to be a member of the Jewish people, about our core values, the core values that animate Jewish peoplehood, and the ways that our relationship to Israel is bolstered or hindered by those values. We are aware that you're here even though we can't see you, and we're going to just be talking to each other, but we welcome you to ask questions via the Q&A feature or participate in the discussion in the chat. We will be looking at the chat throughout the sessions. We'll try to incorporate as much as we can, but if you are watching this on Facebook and you want to submit a question or comment, you're welcome to either join us on the Zoom or email your questions or comments to autumn@centralreform.org. Autumn can also help with any technology issues or send the link to register. We will not be monitoring the Facebook comments during the sessions. And finally, just a note of gratitude to all of our institutions that support us in this endeavor and have supported us in our study, to Congregation Sher Emet, Central Reform Congregation, the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, and Congregation B'nai Emunah. By the way, somebody asked me, I realized not everybody actually knows how we all line up. So to be clear, I'm with the JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council. Jim, who's in my top, I don't know what everyone else's screen, but Jim is Congregation Sher Emet, Carnie is Congregation B'nai Emunah, and Daniel is Central Reform Congregation. So if you didn't know how all those went, I'm sorry we didn't say that sooner. We're also grateful to the Jewish Federation's Shema Listen series for co-sponsoring the program, and deeply grateful to the Shalom Hartman Institute that has given us the space to study and explore and question and challenge, and to find ourselves on this journey as we continue to think about all of these issues that continue to really guide us in our journeys. And so with that, we're going to get started. And I have the distinct pleasure of facilitating us today, and wanted to engage us in a conversation about the ways in which anti-Semitism has in and of itself become a divisive force within our community. I think this is particularly deeply troubling and also in some ways kind of sociologically fascinating, right? I think for so many years, it seems like anti-Semitism was what united the Jewish community. That was sometimes, right, like how we were forced to stay in our specific enclaves and, I mean, literally, right, in ghettos, or whether sort of figuratively, what kind of kept us. And I know I'm certainly seeing it in my work. I would imagine that many of you might be as well. The ways in which now we seem to spend more time arguing about what is anti-Semitism than really coming together to fight anti-Semitism. And so that's where I want to go with the discussion, but I always love the opportunity to start off with some study together. And so with your permission, I am going to bring up my screen and just dive in. I'm always a lover of Talmud text. So can you all see that okay? Great. And so kind of to start us off with this conversation, looking at this discussion between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, famous for the two schools of thought that love to argue with one another, but specifically in the debate about how one says the Shema. And we're going to use this to sort of talk about the different ways in which we approach disagreements. So, Jim, can you just, so I'm not the only one talking since I did that long introduction, can you do the text for us?
Sure. So the Mishnah teaches, Bet Shammai say, in the evening, every man should recline and recite the Shema. And in the morning, he should stand, as it says, and when thou liest down and when thou risest up. Beit Hillel, however, say that every man should recite in his own way, as it says, and when thou walkest by the way. Why then is it said, and when thou liest down and when thou risest up? This means at the time when people lie down and at the time when people rise up.
Okay, so let's pause to make sure. And this is not my translation, so apologies for all of that. I in like the 10 minutes before we started, I thought about redoing it, and then I thought we're just going to go with it. So you know, we can obviously not only men who are saying Shema and things like that. Also, we don't have to do liest, but here we are, right? Okay, so we have this debate that's taking place between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about whether or not we stand or sit when we say the Shema, and it's going to be based off of the text of the Shema itself, right? Within the Shema, we say, right, that we should recite these words, and we say. Specifically, b'shachbacha of kumecha, right, when you lie down and when you get up. And so Beit Shammai says, okay, in the evening you recline and in the morning you stand because it says when you lie down and when you rise up. But Beit Hillel says you can recite it however you are because it also says uvalechtacha v'derech, right, like as you're going on your way. And so the Talmud is going to do this shift where this is oftentimes what happens when two different opinions come up and they're going to disagree about something, but they're also going to disagree about what the verse is that they're basing their opinion on. They're going to say, okay, right, so Beit Shammai kind of says back to Beit Hillel, so fine, if you think it's however you're on your way, then how do you understand when you lie down and when you get up, if you don't think you have to lie down or stand up? And Beit Hillel's response is, that's the time, right? It's when you lie down and when you get up, morning, evening. Okay, so I know you all here probably know that, and I am remembering there's other people watching, right? Okay, so let's keep going with it.
So Rabbi Tarfon now says, I was once walking by the way, and I reclined to recite the Shema in the manner prescribed by Beit Shammai, and I incurred danger from robbers. They said to him, you deserve to come to harm because you acted against the opinion of Beit Hillel. Rabbi Ezekiel then learned if one follows the rule of Beit Shammai, he does right, and if one follows the rule of Beit Hillel, he does right. Rabbi Yosef said, if he follows the rule of Beit Shammai, his action is worthless.
And just a little bit more, we'll finish up here.
Rabbi Nachman ben Isaac said, one who follows the rule of Beit Shammai makes his life forfeit, as we have learned. Rabbi Tarfon said, I was once walking by the way, and I reclined to recite the Shema in the manner prescribed by Beit Shammai, and I incurred danger from robbers. And they said to him, you deserve to come to harm because you acted against the opinion of Beit Hillel.
Thank you. So basically, right, so we've got, I mean, I think sort of more interesting than the discussion about when exactly or how exactly we say the Shema, are we end up with these three opinions more so about kind of what to do with the disagreement, right? We have Rabbi Ezekiel who says, okay, right, this way or this way, they're both fine. We have Rabbi Joseph who says, if you did this, it's just meaningless, like it's as if you did nothing. And then we have Rabbi Nachman ben Isaac, who quotes the story from Rabbi Tarfon and basically says, right, like not only, it's not like it was worthless, like it was dangerous, right? What you did was actually detrimental. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see you all better, right? And so I find this really fascinating because I think this becomes this great overlay to, so our teacher, Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who's presented, and I found it to be really helpful framing for me, really kind of three different models in a way of disagreement. He talks about pluralism, tolerance, and deviance, right? And so pluralism as the recognition that there could be multiple truths, there could be multiple right answers, right? This is the Rabbi Ezekiel opinion, right? Okay, you can do it this way, you can do it this way, and both of them are perfectly fine. Tolerance of I don't like that way, right? But I have to sort of like allow it to exist within my worldview. But I might not think that it's actually legitimate, even though you do, right? And that's the Rabbi Joseph, right? You can say the Shema in the way that Beit Shammai says, but like in my rule book, it doesn't count for anything. But like, okay, I have to allow you to do it, right? And then this idea of deviance, of like that which we need to put outside of the fold completely. And this is the Rabbi Nachman ben Isaac, right, of saying like you deserve to die. I mean, literally, right? Like it's a good thing that these robbers attacked you. You made your life forfeit for doing that. And so, for all of us who've studied, right, Danielle has talked about kind of, and at different places in our life, we might have different things. It's not like any one of us is a full pluralist or a full tolerant, right? We tolerate certain things and we're pluralism about certain things. And there's also deviance. There's things that we have no place for within our societies. But part of what I've heard Danielle argue, and I think I've seen in my experience, and I'm curious for all of you, are the ways in which we as societies have been pushing more and more to move the things that we used to tolerate into the category of deviance, right? That it's not just to say, I don't like this, but I need this to be unacceptable in our community, right? There's no big tent, right? Or not even, let me say it differently, right? Like I've heard many people say like, we are a big tent, but that's outside the tent, right? And so we're all pluralist about the things we like, right? And but that's just beyond the fold. And yet where we're going as a society, when we keep moving too many things to outside the fold, Danielle's not scientific about it, but I think he sort of said, right, like that there's only so much, at a certain point in society, if too much of society is deviant, then there's no more society, right? We all start to collapse with it. And I'm seeing it happening within our Jewish community, right? Where the efforts for people to keep pushing people who are part of our community into this category of deviance. And I'm struggling with it. I'm just gonna open that up for your reflections and comments.
So I'm really struck. I hadn't studied this text in this way before, Rori. When we did this, we get the tolerance deviance with Danielle, but not with this text, I don't think. I'm struck by the ways in which all of the rabbis in this text ultimately express their loyalty to either their Beit Hillel camp or their Beit Shammai camp in their discourse in a way that I think ends up actually superseding the issue that they're talking about, right? What starts as a discussion of whether you are standing or sitting at the Shema ends with saying, I wish the people who disagree with me deserve death. And I actually think that this is in some ways a logical and an inevitable outcome of a discourse that fundamentally is about reinforcing our own tribal boundaries rather than about something larger. And I know we're going to anti-Semitism, and I think this is so much of what anti-Semitism and the discourse around it is, particularly in Israel and the United States and in the cross currents between them, right? The ways in which we leverage anti-Semitism really to reinforce our own existing partisan biases. And partisan doesn't have to be Democrat and Republican, right? It can be the other sort of ways that we divide ourselves up. But yeah, that's my first response.
That's a really interesting read in light of the discussion that you led us on, which I'm still sitting with in many ways, right? But I think part of what I heard you arguing was that, right, like the people who are the rabbis who are citing their view are not citing an additional proof text. They're saying, I'm with Beit Hillel, right, or I'm with Beit, right? Like it's a loyalty, it's not a logic.
For what it's worth, and I'm really convinced by the social science research on this, that like I think that's always how we always operate as humans, all of us. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'll just push the envelope a little bit further. I find this text deeply disturbing, actually. Not so much that they're arguing about the Shema, not even that they're aligning with Rabbi Hillel or Rabbi Shammai's teaching, but that they, as one community, can be so deeply disturbed by their by the practice of others or the failure to practice and align with others in the community, that they as you said, can justify even the death of another member of their community for simply a disagreement. I'm reminded personally of a number of times in my career and my life as an adult Jew when I've experienced something not different from this that much. Early in my career, when I was beginning to practice as a rabbi, and I chose to make the decision to officiate at wedding ceremonies for couples that were not both Jewish, for interfaith, multi-faith couples. I was really attacked vehemently by another rabbi in the community at the time where I was living, who accused me of being an anti-Semite, that my actions officiating at weddings was as destructive to the Jewish community. And he actually said I deserved to be placed in cherem for this. He used that terminology, that I should be excommunicated from the Jewish community because of my choices as far as who I would officiate for. And when I read this text, I see the seeds of that kind of in-group hatred, intra-group hatred, being laid by our tradition, that even that they would maintain this story and not condemn it forthright, that this story, this justification of, somebody being set upon by robbers or even killed as justification, we've seen that over and over and over again in our people's history, and used as justification for Jews hating each other, much less other people hating us. So.
Let me just throw in this comment that I too, Rabbi Bennett, have experienced this in my career, even here in St. Louis, in and around the issues of providing a forum for people to speak the breaking the silence experience, and death threats, threats to my own livelihood and to my family, things along those lines. So a pretty terrible situation. I just want to go back to the text for a moment and do a kind of little diuk, look at something that I think we all are aware of, but should be sensitive to share with people who are joining in this very intimate conversation. And that is that it's Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And we've said this before, I think, amongst ourselves, that there's a difference between Hillel and Shammai saying something and Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai saying something. And so what I'm seeing here are a number of misinterpretations that start at the root of the problem. The root of the problem is they didn't listen to Hillel or Shammai. They listened to Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, who clearly had not listened to Hillel or Shammai, right? Who married each other's children, who had relationships with one another, who honored each other in all kinds of interesting ways. Now, again, the tradition ultimately often moves in the direction of Beit Hillel, not always, but often. But I think we have to go to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is the misstatements in the names of others that start us down a road that we can never recover from. And that in succeeding generations, the more we turn up the temperature and we in some ways demonize others, it will continue to spiral downward to the point where we have the kinds of things that Rabbi Bennett pointed out. And I think the text itself points out that we could potentially talk about somebody has forfeited their life for having a different way in which one goes about reciting the Shema, the declaration that God is one, leads us to that place. And I am deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about that kind of brinksmanship that's being brought to the fore in and around so many issues. We have forgotten how to talk to one another in respectful ways, in honorable ways. And unless we regain that now, forget our Jewish world imploding. We are going to lead to the implosion, as opposed to being an or goyim, a light unto the nations of the world. We're going to schlep the whole world with us into this place of endarkenment. And so I want to make sure to add that piece as I read this text, which I'm so glad, Rori, that you brought it, because I also never read it in the context in which you have shared it. And I'm the oldest Hartman guy here, and I don't know if I ever learned it. So maybe Rabbi Hartman, maybe Danielle had some new texts from the times when he taught us this stuff. It's good. It's good.
I'm reminded, this is going to be like a bit of an off-topic story, but I'm always reminded when I think about this. When I was in college, it was a very silly situation, but I had a dorm room and I had a dorm phone because our cell phones didn't work so well and in this old building. And so, I had a landline, and I stayed over the summer. I had to move dorm rooms, and so I had to move my phone service. But of course, the phone service wasn't like a dorm phone service. It was a regular AT&T phone service. And so I called the person and I said, I'm doing this, and I explained the whole situation. And they said, well, because you're reinstalling it, you don't have the $200 cancellation fee on the contract. And of course, somebody entered something in the computer wrong, and all of a sudden I get this, $200 charge on my bill, and I, call to get it taken care of, and still doesn't get entered correctly. And the next thing I know, I'm getting these letters from collection agencies, and many of you probably had kind of similar stories, right? But I don't know, right? I'm 19 years old. I've never had to deal with this before, and I'm just, infuriated by the whole thing. And I'm talking to everybody I can talk to, and I'm calling up. And I remember one time I had an issue with somebody on the phone, the phone service, and he told me to unplug the phone and plug it back in. And I said, that's going to disconnect the call that we're on. And he said, it's fine, I'll call you right back. And of course he never did, right? And so I'm kind of working my way through the whole system, and this is months and months and months of trying to talk to anybody and everybody. And finally somebody said to me, you can contact the Better Business Bureau. Like, you're not getting this issue resolved. You have all the documentation, you've written them letters, nobody's calling you, whatever it was. And I did. And so I wrote this letter, and a week later I get a phone call from like the executive, whatever, right? And the problem was immediately resolved with all the apologies. And maybe a year or two later, I don't even remember what the other situation was. Something happened, and I had another issue with a big company. And I wrote them this angry letter, and I said, and if this is not resolved, I'm going to contact the Better Business Bureau. And I remember the person wrote back and said, you didn't even give us a chance. Why would you threaten us like that? And it was so, because from my perspective, I wasn't trying to be mean. I just thought, well, this gets results, right? When you do this, you get results. I'd done this other thing for months. And so I thought, well, let me just jump to that. And it was such a lesson for me to have this guy kind of say to me, you don't start with the nuclear option. You start, you didn't even start. And I think about that because I think about the ways in which, as a community, we have done such incredible work to say that when we say something is anti-Semitic, it shuts things down, right? Like when we have pointed out, and it has shut down individuals, it has shut down programming, right? When the Jewish community has pointed it out, and it's taken a lot of work. That was not always historically the case. But I worry that we've all done what I did, which was at a certain point we said, oh, if I say anti-Semitism, things stop, and I don't have to say anything else, right? Like,
Rory, it's the use of righteous indignation as the ultimate trump card that nobody can argue with. Because when you go to the realm of righteous indignation, you don't get righteous indignation, an A, unless you're right. And also, you reach that point of brinksmanship without even listening to what another person has to say. You sort of negate the entire conversation before it even begins. You shut it down. And I think you're pointing out a very significant aspect of what's happening in our world today. The dialogue doesn't mean listening to people you agree with all the time, right? And maybe the possibility exists that they're actually saying something that would impact and change you in such a profound kind of way, but you come ready, to fight it even before you hear what it is they have to say. Sometimes because it's the nature of the person coming at you, maybe because you've had experiences with this individual or group of individuals in the past. Right? But if that was the case, we would never be able, as you well know, right, all of us who've been involved in dialogue, if we come in with preconceived notions of what this group, put any kind of group there, is going to say to us before we get there, then what's the point of having the dialogue? Don't even have the encounter. And I think that's the key part here is the ability to re-encounter people, to re-see people in ways that we haven't seen before, because we are living in an unprecedented era, potentially letovah, in a positive way. Think about it, the kinds of conversations that you're able to have, Rory, in particular, I imagine, with a broad swath of people that you're talking to. Like when you were that 19-year-old in college, or maybe before that, would you have ever imagined that this is the kind of work that you're going to be doing? Maybe yes. I know, surely, what I say, 25 years into the rabbinate, I am so embarrassed by the rabbi I was 25 years ago, because I knew so little. And yet I thought I knew so much. And that level of humility leads me at least away from what I want to call the brinksmanship of righteous indignation, to which we cannot jump. Now, we also have moments where there is righteous indignation, but let's check that before we jump to that level. Go 0 to 90, in 2 seconds without understanding what's happening.
Can I just interject and say yes, amen to everything, but also, Rori, I thought when you were telling your story, you were going to claim that they were being anti-Semitic in their behavior towards you. And I say that only partially in jest, not about you, but that is another face of this conversation that I think we have to lift up, which is we as a Jewish community are very raw, justifiably so. We have lots of reasons to think things are anti-Semitic, but often they are not. And when we assume that the person who disagrees with us or holds a different position, whether they're within the Jewish community or especially if they're outside the Jewish community, whether their disagreement with us or their complete rejection of what we might be saying or standing for, when we assume that means they're anti-Semitic, I think we're going down a very dangerous path. And the humility that Rabbi Rose, talks about is really a communal responsibility that we, not only individually, but collectively, we as Jews maybe need to stop calling everything anti-Semitism, because somehow that makes us feel better as a Jewish community.
So I want to bring in a framing from our contemporary discourse of cancel culture for a moment, which, first of all, I am utterly convinced that 95% of the time when people say cancel culture, really what they're saying is they want to say racist or sexist or anti-Semitic or homophobic or transphobic or whatever things, and they're mad that they can't say it anymore, 95% of the time. But I also want to hold on to the notion that Jews have long been a cancel culture kind of people, right? May their name be blotted out. We just had Purim, right? We literally cancel Haman's name, right? Like, I hope people are grogging in the background or something when I say that. We have a whole concept of cherem. The notion of this goes back further in Jewish thinking as well. But I want to hold on to one of the notions that Daniel talks about, which is the difference between acceptable deviance and unacceptable deviance. Right, where there is deviance that we regard as deviant, but are still willing to engage in communication around it. And there's deviance which we regard as so across the line that we believe that is a point that communication should stop. Rory, you and I have had a conversation about one of our elected officials who I feel strongly has crossed over into the realm of unacceptable deviance, and that the Jewish community should call them out, and that should be the end of it. But I also want to, while we're talking about that unacceptable deviance, I also want to talk about the important things that cancel culture and unacceptable deviance bring, right? Like, there's a reason we talk about may their name be blotted out. And there's a reason why there are some opinions that should be unacceptable in society, right? Like, what goes along with cancel culture is also that trans folk can feel more comfortable being themselves in society, that Black folk can be safe in society, that, right? Like, let's be clear what it is that is being canceled here too, at that boundary of acceptable and unacceptable deviance. So.
Well, and that's exactly, I think, right, like, that's where the battle of the heart of cultures actually lie, right? And Daniel makes the point, he says, fundamentally, it actually doesn't make any difference between if you find yourself in a category of pluralism, tolerance, or he calls it, I think, tolerable deviance. He says, because like from your life, like, it doesn't matter, right? Like, fundamentally, it means you're living your life and I have to let you have it. Whether or not I think your opinion is equal to mine or I think your opinion is lesser than mine actually doesn't change your life at all. It might change me, it doesn't change you, right? But it's, and this movement between those, it goes in both directions, right? Ways in which groups have fought to shift themselves. And so I think, I mean, specifically like the LGBTQ community, right? Where there's times in history where it was seen as an intolerable deviance, right? It was seen as a like mental illness in some of the DSM, right? Like all of those, right? To shift over. And part of the way that happens is also because just enough people, because it's to his point, right? You can't kind of keep canceling this massive group of people, but also the ways in which like the Me Too movement has started to shift over, where like sexual harassment. And I'm amazed, like, even if you just look at like television shows from 10 years ago, like if you watch reruns, like the jokes that used to be so much more acceptable that like, I don't remember, like I remember loving these television shows, and suddenly it's a pandemic and you rewatch it and you think, oh my gosh, like we didn't, like, it didn't even occur to us that was an inappropriate joke, right? So like it can work absolutely, in both of those directions, but that's how we start to define our culture, by what we put on either side of that barrier. Carnie, you look like you want to jump in on that.
I want to jump in just on two pieces. First of all, there's a question in the chat, which I think is a good one, since it's leading us in the direction of how do we define anti-Semitism, each of us? That might be an interesting piece, and maybe we're getting there, but I think it's worth understanding that people are asking that question as we use the term. But the first thing is sort of a la the conversation about TV shows that we watch now. When I first came to B'nai Emunah, when anything went wrong, the telephones didn't work, the copy machine didn't work, Rabbi Lipnick of blessed memory would say, it's anti-Semitism. And we sort of laughed at that, right? But the more that I've lived in this particular, as we are living through it now, it's really easy. Everything is anti-Semitism, right? We don't like something and we smack that label on it, and it's anti-Semitism. We were part of a discussion the other evening, which was an interesting discussion about BDS, right? Boycott, divest, and sanction. Now, I'm not personally in favor of BDS, okay? But to label every person, Jewish and not Jewish, or not Jewish and Jewish, as a person who says that BDS may be an orientation and an approach that they want to take, or maybe selective BDS, maybe not buying products from Judea and Samaria, from the occupied territories, is an anti-Semite. We slap it on very quickly and very easily in order to marginalize them. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I just want to remind colleagues who probably remember this. Remember when Buber started to have encounters with Gandhi, and they had this conversation back and forth, right, about what is evil. And of course, for Buber, in the classic sense, it was you don't recognize the I-thou relationship. You don't recognize that we're all connected to one another. You don't see each other, right? That's Buber. And Gandhi writes back and says, when a British soldier takes a baby, throws it in the air, and catches it at the end of the bayonet, that's not a lack of I-thou. That is radical evil. And actually, Buber later on comes up with a new concept of evil, which he calls radical evil. I think we have to be very careful on both sides of this thing. We have to call things out that are radical evil, but be very judicious in the utilization of what is radical evil, just as we need to be judicious about what we call out as anti-Semitism. The photocopy machine not working is not anti-Semitism. As much as insiders, we can laugh at that. But it's dangerous to even use that kind of language, because it creates this further pushing us apart from one another as opposed to hearing one another.
So if I can jump in, to me, I think one of the big things, and it's one of the big mistakes that I think we make broadly with the isms and with cancel culture, or whatever we're calling it, is focusing on the anti-Semite and not anti-Semitism, or racist and not racism, right? Like, I have deep racism within me. I process the world in a racist way. I think all of us do. I don't think you can be an American and not process the world in a racist way. But the essentialization to a person that you are a racist or you are an anti-Semite, that's when the conversation stops, and it's the essentialization of the ethics of that human being. And I think it's also so un-Jewish, right? We come from such a tradition that focuses on the impact of our actions, so much more so than even the intentions. And so to me, that is almost the ball game here, is moving the conversation, right? Think about the Shema. It became about an essentialized version of these people that we were debating, rather than dealing with the specifics of the problematics, right? And clearly we need to cancel racism, right? And anti-Semitism. But I think hopefully this is the lesson we've learned. It's certainly the lesson I have learned from the Trump era, is that when we just cancel the words so that people feel like they are canceled, it just stews and creates the worst of us, right? Rather than becoming an opportunity for engagement and learning.
Somewhat like another faith who would put it this way, Daniel, hate the sin, love the sinner, right? To call out the actions that we find unacceptable, but not to equate the person performing the action with with being deviant because they are acting that way.
So I would go even a step further. For me, it's not just the actions, it's the impact of their actions, which is problematic. I like it because I think it's just a step more technical, but I also think it's a step more removed. And I think that removal can help us see it sometimes, right? Like I can see the impact of my language on women and trans folk around me in a way that I never saw the impact of my language 5 years ago. And I can change it because I see it as the impact of my actions rather than needing to change myself or even change my actions. And it also refocuses it on the people who are suffering as a result rather than centering it on us.
I so deeply appreciate all of this. And I think, Carnie, to go back also to the question that we had received, right? Part of it is I think we're going to be working towards a definition in some ways, and I think, and frankly, I'm actually not a fan of any one technical definition of which everybody is then kind of there's no chart of okay, you're in the line or over the line, but we'll, because I think there's a lot to unpack within this, and I think part of also what we're unpacking, and I think these are part of the layers of anti-Semitism. I'm also appreciative. Kent brought up the attack on the cemetery in University City that took place, I guess it's 4 years ago, maybe now. And what was so, for all of us who experienced it, what was so poignant in that, and I think is so important in our language, was even while we recognized that there was a criminal definition of hate crime, right? And ultimately, when they did solve the crime, this person did not fit the requirement for it to be a hate crime. It still didn't change the fact that as a Jewish community, we experienced it through our trauma of anti-Semitism, which was a trauma that I want to be clear was not just attacks on Jews, right, which is one element of it, of the fact that this was a Jewish cemetery, but the fact that attacking Jewish cemeteries is itself a historical way that Jewish communities have been erased, particularly within Europe. And so I think that's also, right, the ways in which, and I appreciate, I think, Daniel, you're also kind of pushing us to parse out this language, because I think it's true, right, where I think there's different ways, right? Because I think there's also times where people, I appreciate what you were saying, and I also think there's people who get very defensive, right? I'm not racist, right? But the recognition that my language can be racist, right? And I didn't intend it to be, but because I'm not aware of the ways in which that rhetoric has historically been used intentionally to marginalize the Black community, I don't realize that me inheriting that language, right? And so the ways in which—
that your intent not to be racist doesn't matter. It's the impact of your words on people who are racialized that matters.
Well, so yes and no. I mean, I think it matters. I don't think I can say it doesn't. I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily erase the harm that you've caused. I think it matters because I do think it's significant if I was intentionally trying to be harmful or if I was unintentional. It depends on whose perspective, right, we're looking at. So I don't want to be kind of dismissive of that. But I think the notion that I did not intend to be racist did not mean my language any less racist language, right? And so I also think that as we talk about anti-Semitism, I think it's really important. Yes, I'm very hesitant to ever use the term anti-Semite. I think that's a far line that I think you really have to push it to kind of get to that line for me. I think for me to talk about anti-Semitic rhetoric or anti-Semitic tropes or things that play on anti-Semitic themes, right? And those are oftentimes, I think, harder because people don't always realize, because unless you're in the Jewish community and the ways in which Jews as money lenders, Jews as right, all of those things, and so suddenly, right, and so it's where you hear people start to get into these gray areas because they'll suddenly say, well, there's this television show, and how come the banker on the show has, he has a big nose, and right, but it's because what makes us uncomfortable is that it's playing on this history of the ways in which those images have been used intentionally to marginalize and attack and justify attacks on the Jewish community, even if it wasn't meant to be intentional, even if it was just oh, they were just trying to create a sort of nebbishy guy, but the sort of, right, those same things that kind of make somebody the nebbishy guy are the same things that make somebody the sort of Jewish character. And that doesn't mean that I think the writers of that show are anti-Semites, but it's the ways in which we can call out anti-Semitic tropes that continue to pervade within our society.
Daniel, it's a really great gut check, the challenge, I think, for me at least. And I learned a lot just listening to you say that, maybe on the heels of your own experience, particularly as of late. To me, it really resonated. I caught myself being emotional as you said it and sort of checking myself like, and I think that's actually a wonderful thing. What would we want more than a text of Jewish tradition to resonate so deeply within us that it talks to our contemporary reality, and helps us reimagine who we might be and how we might use this gift of language that we have. So I want to thank you for that. It really was meaningful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I share that reaction. I think we all do, and I want to push a little bit in a slightly different direction, though. I find myself sympathetic to some of what you lifted up, Daniel, about the presence of this cancel culture in which we're living, where everything and everyone is finding their issue upon which they, all of us are focusing our negative energies. So whether it's calling out something that feels to a Jew to be anti-Semitic, whether it's calling out something that feels racist or feels anti-woman or anti-LGBTQ or whatever the issue might be, I'm wondering whether we as a community could role model a different approach entirely, which is focusing our energies on what we want things to be rather than constantly calling out what we want things not to be. And, thinking that there's an anti-Semite under every rock, which is the sort of the traditional stance that I think the Jewish community often takes on all of these conversations. If instead we could say, what would the world look like if we were not looking for anti-Semitism or racism, but instead we were building the opposite, whatever that looks like? What does the world look like that is absent all these isms? I don't know quite how to structure that aspiration, but I think that for me, that's part of this conversation as well.
I appreciate that, Jim. And I also think there's something that's also somewhat lacking in that, just in the sense, I think in an idealized version of the world, I would agree with it. I think the challenge is that we don't live in a world that's been absent that. And so I think that's the ways in which I can inadvertently do harm, is because I'm having a conversation, in the hope, right, like just sort of totally face to face. But if I'm not cognizant of the ways that historically certain language has been used or certain questions have been used or whatever it might be, then I don't realize the ways that I could be perpetuating that harm, right? So I think like we can't just say, right, like, oh, we're going to treat every person as if they're all equal, because the world has never treated all people as equal. And so I think we also do need to be cognizant of the ways in which we continue on the paths that have already been started.
Yeah, I think I agree. What I'm saying is we seem to be living, and this is just a thought that is just being generated. I haven't thought this through deeply, but we live in this stance of constant chatati right now. We're constantly pounding on our chests, many of us, or telling others that they should be pounding on their chests in calling out our sins. And I wonder if we could flip that on. This is one of the things that's always bothered me about the Jewish community's self-focused obsession on anti-Semitism. We spend all of our time and energy calling out the behavior and others that we want to cancel. You are bad because you're, and we do it to ourselves too now. We are all, I share that, Daniel. I think you called us out appropriately. We all live that way. We are all recognizing in this world we're in that we are all racist. We are all sexist. We have these isms within us. But I'm wondering, for me, that Judaism has always been lacking. A Judaism of chatati, of I sinned, we've sinned, we're sinning all the time. That's not a Judaism that motivates aspirational behavior. That maybe that's a starting point, but the question is, can we flip it now and say, what do we want the world to look like? It's not, and to do that, to go back to your opening, Rori, we have to turn to those that we want to reject because they are horrifying to us, they're abhorrent to us, their behaviors are horrifying, and we have to say, I want to listen to you, I want to understand you, I want to know you. I don't want to apologize anymore. I want to move forward from that. I don't know. Maybe we can't. Maybe the world is just so messed up right now that we can't.
I so resonate with what you're saying, Jim. And I feel like I spent the first 5 years of my rabbinate, I've been a rabbi for 10 years now, giving sermons about how we have to stop weaponizing anti-Semitism for the sake of Jewish identity. And in particular, that like drives me insane, the ways that we use anti-Semitic events to like, join our synagogue. This awful thing, this awful murder of Jews happened. Don't you think you should join our synagogue because of that? It drives me nuts. In fact, I like forgot what I was saying because I'm so driven nuts by that right there. But I remember. But then the second half of my so far 10-year rabbinate has been spent experiencing near constant anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic violence, anti-Semitic hate mail, and like, I don't know about y'all, I can guess, at least Rori, that this is going to be true of, like a week doesn't go by when I don't get a message from somewhere that's like, we're going to send you back to the ovens or something like that. And I just want to hold on to that too, because something has changed, I think, in America in the last 5 years that it's different. Or at least that's my experience.
I don't want to erase in this conversation that there is real anti-Semitism, right? Like that is not what I want to be doing at all in this conversation. But I think that the challenge is how we navigate through that, right? And I think to part of it, I'm always struck. I'm always really struck by, I think, the story that we have of Moses, right? Like when he sort of first like is sort of recognized as a leader. It's interesting because we do get an origin story. We don't always get that, right? Sometimes like God just calls to Noah and God calls to Abraham. We get Moses when he's born and we see him at other points in his life, but like his moment when he's called by God is at the burning bush. And what I love about the story is that the way the text describes the story, and I'm obviously paraphrasing out of context, so all of you will correct me, right? But Moses is wandering along, and he notices this burning bush, and he actually says, I need to turn aside and behold this wonder. Why is this bush not being consumed? And the way that the text is written of this bush being burned is actually really ambiguous as to whether or not the bush is being burned because Moses is walking by, or whether the bush was actually always burning and Moses is the first person to notice it, right? But what I love is I think the message for me from our Jewish community is that what makes him a leader in that moment, he doesn't become a leader in a moment of strength. He's actually already killed an Egyptian, and he doesn't really handle that very well, right? It's not about his strength. It's that he's willing to stop and look, and he asks a question, right? Like that to me, right? It's like, what does it mean to ask a question, to say there is an experience that I don't understand that's happening right now, and I need to ask a question, but then he has to listen for the answer, and the answer is God calling to him. Like that to me, I think is what I think should be the essence of what we all strive for. And so what is it in all of these moments to say, right? I mean, I'm struck. So, I can't help in all this discussion, but think about Daniel and I just spent yesterday in Jefferson City, and there were some intense conversations, but I remember, Daniel, were you in the room? Right. There was, when we were testifying in the House the second time around, I think there was a point when one of the legislators said, I can't tell you what your experience is like any more than, you're not going to be able to tell me what my experience is to be Black, and I'm not going to tell you what your experience is as a trans person, right? And there was something, right? And he said, but I want to hear you, right? I mean, the follow-up, he said, I want to hear, and I'm trying to understand, and I know I'm never going to understand any more than you're going to understand. And it was actually this like profoundly beautiful, I thought, kind of, moment of saying, I can't live your life, but I can say that I know that I don't know, and that I'm willing to listen to the experience. And that's the part to me that I think like we've lost, right? Like that I think like all of this has been this sort of like debate about, no, I want to call anti-Semitism, or I don't want you to talk, or I don't want that speaker, right? As opposed to actually to say like, what is the experience that you're having, right? Because I also think part of my experience has been also experiencing the anti-Semitism, and it's also been experiencing when I've said to somebody that is, and I will never say to somebody like, you're an anti-Semite, but I might say that language to me evokes anti-Semitic rhetoric, and people saying, no, you can't keep saying that because everyone keeps saying anti-Semitism, right? I've had people say back to me, no, and that's really dangerous and hurtful also, right? And so what is it for all of us to be able to say, like, here's what I experienced when you spoke. Here's what right? Because going back to my other example, if I use inadvertently racist language, right? What I want is not somebody to say, you're a racist and I'm done, right? But how does somebody say, here's what that language does to me?
Rori, I love what you just said. I just want to say, I think the challenge for us as a Jewish community is not to think that we can impose that on others. We can only impose it on ourselves. And so, there have been a number of questions about, for example, BDS. I mean, I feel very strongly that when I hear somebody say things that might sound anti-Semitic or feel anti-Semitic or evoke anti-Semitism, my knee-jerk reaction might be to say, that's anti-Semitic. You can't say that. You have to do the work of chatati. You have to do that. But what I think the takeaway here from listening to you, for me at least, is that's not my place. I don't have the right to tell somebody else what they should be thinking or feeling. I have to work on myself. And for me, at least, and I'm not telling anybody else what to do, I don't think BDS, for example, is anti-Semitic dafka automatically in all cases. I think somebody who legitimately finds criticism with Israel or the way that the government of Israel is acting or behaving is not automatically an anti-Semite, or their behavior is not anti-Semitic feeling to me. And I need to work on myself, hopeful that others will do that as well. To me, that's the issue. And the same is true of racism. And when Daniel says to me, I feel like I'm racist, I feel the same way in myself. That calls me to reflect on my own internal struggle with racism. And I'm not worried about anybody else's racism. I can't fix that. Maybe I can.
But do we, Rabbi Jim, have the responsibility to teach this Torah that way? In other words, like, let's make sure that we're doing the gut checks, that we're doing that internal introspection about what this means. And can we help teach the world lishna, like a language that we can utilize for having this conversation in a way that not self-flagellating, right? Oh yeah, here we are, doing it right. That's not what we're about here. We're about growth. It's interesting, Rori, I'd be interested to ask you, just for my own thought process. So was that burning bush always burning, or did it only start burning when Moshe Rabbeinu came? And I don't know if you're asking, so what the heck difference does it make, in the point you were trying to make? For me, it actually does make a certain kind of point. And I love the notion, like with Avram Avinu, right, that the birah doleket, that house is on fire, right, with that beautiful midrash too, right, that it always was there. These challenges that we are facing right now have always been present. And living as we do in the era in which we find ourselves, the challenges that are upon us now as a people who see ourselves having a special calling and a special mission are different than they were a generation ago. And it's not that I don't appreciate those people who immediately feel anti-Semitic overtones. I get it. But my job now as a rabbi is to sensitize those people and say, I really hear you. I understand where you're coming from. Your experience is your experience, but we're not there anymore. And it brings us right back to the beginning of this conversation all those months ago. Which Torah do we want to live by? Do we want to live a Torah of expansiveness, which is the Torah of Sinai, right? Every day the voice goes out from Sinai. It's going out, it's outward, outward, outward. Or do we want to live in the Torah of Holocaust and destruction, which puts us in the ashes, which puts us in the grave? And I think returning always to this notion of is anti-Semitic, anti-Semitic, it puts us back in that place, and there is no growth from that place. There's no development, not only of our own religious tradition, but of our contribution to the religious, spiritual, communal well-being of the country in which we find ourselves, the world in which we occupy. And I'll just, I skipped off Israel, but I think Israel there too. The lack of the ability to understand that there must be a growth factor, that we must infuse the world with growth factor, limits us all and puts us in a negative place. And so we need to be doing, not ufaratza, the way in which some of our co-religionists talk about ufaratza. This is a new kind of ufaratza. And I have to say, by the way, when I first started at Hartman, I was really suspect if some of this Torah, Kimi Tzion Teitzei Torah, we used to say Kimi Hartman Teitzei Torah, was it really going to work? And what's so interesting is, if you think about it, Hartman needed to kind of start a North American version of what it was doing in Israel to get the Ki Mitzion Teitzei Torah. And by the way, now we have two Torahs. We have the Torah of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, Hartman Israel, and we have Hartman North America. And trust me, the Machlokot L'Shem Shamayim, the arguments for the sake of heaven between those staffs, is a great model for us to be thinking about as we move this process forward in and around all issues, but I think especially in and around the issues of anti-Semitism. What Rabbi Bennett said was so powerful for me as well. I am not a person who is personally in favor of BDS, but to immediately categorize somebody who feels that way based on the principles, based on living their deepest, most moral, ethical, spiritual life, for me to categorize them with that kind of we use in the term nibulpe, right? It's sort of like it is a castigation of a person that cuts them to the quick and makes them not even worthy of a conversation. And that's unfair. And I'll even say, from my way of thinking, un-Jewish. You cannot dehumanize somebody because you disagree with their political orientation to the world, or you disagree with what bothers them and disturbs them as they try to live their best life.
Carnie, that was beautiful. Sometimes you speak in poetry. It just comes out. It's beautiful. I'm thinking of another text about a debate between Hillel and Shammai that struck me. There's a story, it's in the Mishnah and gets expanded in the Gemara about a beam, like a big wooden beam that holds up an expensive kind of palace, and what you're supposed to do if that big expensive wooden beam is stolen. Right? We get two options given where Hillel says, Shammai, right, immediately say we should start with the more sort of strict constructionist here, Shammai, who says the justice is about the person whose beam was stolen getting it back, right? That was the beam, it was their beam, they want their beam back, not another beam, not the monetary equivalent of a beam, but their beam, right? And actually they say all those things. Beit Hillel responds, no, we actually allow for the monetary payment. Right? Because it was stolen and built into this palace, right? What are you going to do? You're going to tear down the whole palace to get the beam back to the person who it was stolen for? But it's the logic that Hillel offers that I think strikes me here, because Hillel says the reason we do this is because we have to offer a road to tshuva, and that if you tear down the palace, there's no more road to tshuva. And what strikes me about this story is that, first of all, Hillel is not compromising on justice, right? It's not your beam back, but it is the monetary equivalent and more of your beam. It is still justice first, but it's a justice that allows a road to growth for the people who did wrong, so that tshuva is possible. And I don't know, I just wonder if this is another model for us here too.
I think that's all well said, and I'm looking at our time, and I'm not going to end us immediately, but as kind of we start to wind down, I think fundamentally, as we talk about anti-Semitism, I think we need a really narrow definition, right? I think at its core, I think it is a hatred of and an attack on the Jewish people for being Jewish, right? Like, what is it to hate Jews for being Jews? I remember getting into a debate a few years ago, and I ultimately wrote an op-ed about it because I don't even remember exactly how it came about, but somebody was trying to argue, and I was saying like all attacks on Jews are not anti-Semitism, right? Like if somebody mugs a Jew on the train because they wanted somebody's wallet, like that's not anti-Semitism, right? Unless they're specifically saying that person looks Jewish, right? And unfortunately, right, we've seen this, right? So if it was an attack on the cemetery, knowing it was the Jewish cemetery, when we saw Jews in New York who were very visibly Jewish being attacked with verbal attacks against Jews, right? We know there's, right, but and by the way, like ways in which attacks against groups of people can actually cross over groups of people, right? We know that there are people who are not Jewish who have been victims of anti-Semitism because they work in our buildings or because they interact, right? The 3 Christians who were killed at the Kansas City JCC a few years ago, right? Or the Jews who were killed in Mississippi for registering Black voters who were killed from racism, right? That each of these things, right? It's not just about, right? So an attack on Jews is not necessarily anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism doesn't exclusively kill Jews, right? But if a person thinks that this person is Jewish and attacks them for being Jewish, I think that's where we start to get anti-Semitism. But I think sorry, I just want to add, right? I think I want to just like name what I've said before also, though, that I think that ways in which, though, we talk about historical anti-Semitism, I think is an important part of this conversation. And so ways in which like this person might not be intentionally harming me in any way, shape or form, but where their rhetoric is evocative of rhetoric that had historically been the reason why my ancestors had to flee a country or lost their citizenship or were victims of genocide, right? Like that also, right, that evokes something. And I think we need to have a different language, which is why I think when we talk about like anti-Semitic tropes or anti-Semitic rhetoric, because it becomes an important distinction within that.
And let us not confuse, right, the difference between, I want to say, being uninformed, say stupidity and malice.
Sure.
There is a big difference between those two things. And I think we jump immediately to malice, which I think is detrimental not only to the conversations that we want to have, but I'll actually say it this way. And I've said this all about Hartman. My experience at Hartman was I realized that most of my rabbinic career till I went to Hartman was focused on the preservation of the Jewish body. And if I learned anything at Hartman, it was that we have to be equally as leaders in the Jewish world concerned about the neshama, the soul of the Jewish people. That's what really touched me, right? To the point where I remember David Hartman of blessed memory, Rabbi Hartman, got up and said, if Judaism, if Yiddishkeit isn't a tradition that refines us, and he actually literally, I mean, those of you who heard Hartman speak, he literally started crying during the talk. Then there was no reason for me to have left Montreal. There was no reason for me to move to Israel. No reason for the מכון. There was no reason for Judaism itself to exist. So I think we have the ability in this conversation to talk about the sensitization and belief that the work that we're doing is really the holy of holies. At least for me, it feels that way. And if we work on our own souls, and then we can share what we have done as a community, and we can learn from others how to do this as well, because other people of spirit are doing this. We can together move away from all of these isms, which are destroying us and making us small and narrow and constricted. And as we head towards Pesach, we want to expand. Let's get the hell out of Egypt, and let's get all B'nei Arenu V'Zkenenu, all of us, this Erev Rav, all of us, not in a negative sense, but all of us who belong in this unbelievable melting pot, which is the world in which we find ourselves at this moment.
Jim, you look like you've tried to jump in a couple of times.
No, that's fine. Carnie, you spoke beautifully. I could put an exclamation point on it. What I was thinking as you were talking was, it's exactly what Daniel was saying a few moments ago. The issue is not the ism, whatever the ism is, and we can't be self-obsessed with our own ism, to the exception of all the others. And Daniel, when you called it out as justice, what, our obligation, our responsibility is to make the whole world better, not just to correct the wrongs being committed against us. And this is what bothers me so terribly about Jews becoming so obsessed with anti-Semitism, while turning around and practicing all the other isms with abandon, to sort of say it with an extreme voice. And instead of calling out the isms and criticizing those who we don't like or who don't like us or we don't agree with, we need to each be working on our own soul first, Carnie, I think, for the soul of the Jewish people. That's ultimately the path there.
I want to throw out another piece here too, because I think there's a hole in our scholarship right now, as I understand it, which is actually causing a hole in our discourse. At least I don't know of many people who are taking the tools of contemporary racial critiques, wokeness, if you want to use a sort of dismissive word somewhat, but like structural critiques of our moment, the ism critiques that help us understand the way that power works, and applying it to anti-Semitism. I see almost no work dealing with it. I see the best thinkers that I know of around anti-Semitism, people like Dr. Deborah Lipstadt. I don't think she understands critical race theory, actually, or at least isn't applying it. That's not fair to say. I don't think she's using it academically to apply it to anti-Semitism. Again, not necessarily a critique at her. I just don't see other, right? She's like at the peak of anti-Semitic discourse, right? Or discourse around anti-Semitic, maybe, anti-Semitism. And I think it's a real hole that's hurting our language because we don't have a way to integrate these structuralisms into our understanding of anti-Semitism, which I think has to be done so that we can understand the isms and the impacts rather than the intents and the ites.
Just to defend our teacher for a moment, I want to say the following, not that she needs my defending, but I think Deborah Lipstadt, Professor Lipstadt, represents something really interesting, right? She herself, this is existential for her, the Shoah and anti-Semitism. And so we need, Daniel, I'll age myself. We need your generation, right? Maybe you and Rori are a little closer, and Rabbi Bennett and I are a little closer to each other in age. But we need this consciousness. That to use the term wokeness is appropriate here. And we need to understand that we're doing the work that we're doing, and we need to evolve. You're only as old as your ideas. And we need to evolve these ideas, and we need the consciousness that you're bringing to these conversations to help us understand it. And I think that the work that that Deborah Lipstadt has done is so very important to one stage of our evolution.
Oh yeah, please. Language sounded like I was dismissing her. I deeply apologize. And her whole notion of punching up is so powerful.
And really, I have no reason. She didn't sign my my basketball or whatever. She's not. It's not because I mean I love Deborah Lipstadt for what she does, but I also understand her limitations and her agenda. Each of us ultimately knows that we can only fulfill this part of the mission. Right. And I really appreciate that Rabbi Bennett brought us back there. We got to start with ourselves. Where we're going to end, none of us knows. Okay, start with check ourselves, work on ourselves. We have influence in small circles of our own families. Right. We're going to have these starim. Maybe we'll even have one or two members of our community. We'll have the conversation there. And then we are blessed as religious leaders to be able, to do it with communities. And we all have platforms, right, of being able to talk beyond our circles to other religious leaders. That entree, when I call a church or I call a mosque, they take my call. Most Jews don't take my call, but and my members for sure don't take my calls. But when I call a church or a mosque, people pick up the phone and they want to talk to us. And that's one of the great blessings of America, which of course is so different than in a past generation. That's why the old models of anti-Semitism don't work anymore, because it isn't the old world anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism, but it's not the anti-Semitism that we might have experienced in Europe or even in the early days of being here in America. It is a new version, and therefore we need new solutions, right? I think more open-minded, more open-hearted, more spirited and spiritual responses to the anti-Semitism that we're experiencing right now, up to and including, I'll just use this term, Rahmanas. Forgive them, Father, just to use another tradition. They know not what they do. I really believe that in my heart. Like, I don't know, Rory, if that's your experience, Jim, Daniel, if your experience, when you call somebody out on it and you say, you know what this does to me, not to Jewish people, but to me, people look at you and say, I'm so sorry. I never really intended. And, you know, people use with me, yeah, you Jewed me down on that one, Rabbi, you know, like, and really? Like, and I say, you know what, that makes us, and they're so apologetic. So let's have the same kind of humility. Let's have the same kind of moral compass internally and say, when we do it, we got to take ownership of it. And we have to modify our language. My mom put something beautiful in the in the chat. She said, you know, if everyone could live the way Heschel talks about making your life a work of art, how do you make the world more beautiful? How do you bring chen into the world? And here's one of the ways we can be chenedik. We can be chenedik by taking responsibility for our own limitations and then preaching it out to the world in whatever concentric circles we want or feel we can. And we'll all know that it's only going to be ad kan, and then we're going to fail. But maybe our children and our grandchildren will continue the work based on the rocket fuel we gave them by virtue of the way in which we lived our work of art, which is our lifetime.
I'm gonna bring us to a close with that, because I think that was just so incredibly said. Let me first of all apologize. I genuinely was busy, Carnie. I wasn't ignoring your call. I really I have your message. I'll call you back soon. No,
You don't have to call anymore.
yeah.
I talked to a leader of the Lutheran community. They immediately called me back, and it's all good.
No, but I want to leave us. You know, earlier, Carnie, you reminded me when you asked the question of, you know, do we actually, right, is the bush really, was it really always burning, or was it just for Moses? I am inclined towards the idea that it was always burning, partially because I think that's also, right, what does it mean for our leadership, not to be called, right, but to find themselves within it, but also because I'm so moved. There's a poem that I absolutely love, an excerpt from an Elizabeth Barrett Browning poem, and I use this sometimes also with the Bira Joleket, and Jim, you know it, right, and it says, earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries. And I just, to me, you know, what does it mean, right? Like, and I think that's part of where I am so thankful to all of you of where this conversation has come. And I think, to me, right, what is it to walk through a world in which every bush is afire with God, in which every person has the spark of the divine within them, and in which our journey is not to put out any of those fires, right, but to open our hearts to listen, and to find that divine in even what seems like the mundane. And I think that is, you know, oftentimes we get caught up in the muck of the work, and there is, right, there's dirt also, there's dirt under the, right, like this work is not always the cleanest or the easiest, but that we have the potential to really see that spark within everything, and to cause others, I think in leading the world in that way, to also inspire others to see the spark within themselves. And so I take to heart what you said, Jim, about all we can really do is work on ourselves. But I also do genuinely believe that in that process that we can all aspire to something far bigger, and to a far bigger discussion that is not about who do we want to keep out, but how do we have the most space in our own hearts to let everybody in.
Those rising tides for each of us will raise all the boats. It has to begin with us, but that's the real truth. By the way, just in terms of the fire, you know, I am also not a fan of this being a destructive fire. This is a warming fire, right? And I think we have to think about it that way. We had somebody in the comments said something beautiful, you know, like it should be about the joys of Judaism, not the oys of Judaism. I think we all agree about that. It's not that there are moments for oy. There are moments for oy, but I think the question is, where's the dagesh chazak? Where's the main emphasis of what we want to do?
Well, and the Torah says that, Carnie, that the fire doesn't destroy. The fire doesn't burn.
Hey, I went to the seminary right outside those gates, and the flesh was not consumed. Right.
Not
by the way,
consumed.
I think even with the Bira Doleket, right? Even the Midrash with Abraham, right? Somebody pointed out to me at one point, because I was teaching it, and I was teaching it of like the Palace of Flame, and they came out, they said, or like
a glow.
The lights are on, right? Like that, it's all a glow, right? And so, like, how also, right? Is it this, like, somebody left the lights on for you, and there's this warm place for you to come home to, or it's all burning down, right? Like the world is both, right? The world is both of those right now.
It's paying attention that we have to do. We have to wake up and open our eyes and see. That's
I got you, but I just want to add something, Rori, just to go back to why I think the fire was always there. You see, I don't think the fire was there to be utilized to be burning things down. That's not why the fire was lit in the first place. The problem is, like many things in life, we take it and we bastardize it. We use it not for holy, sacred purposes, but rather to serve other purposes, be they ego, right? Be they other kinds of, there's a lot we can do with it. And there's a reason we burn the chametz, right? Which is really the manifestation of our egos. We got to burn away that stuff that takes us away from the real purpose. And it's not by accident that we get rid of it, by fire, because it's that fire that's been there since the beginning of time. And lots of traditions have that notion of the primordial fire that's been lit. If we can return to the rationale for why the Holy One of Blessing lit that spark, right? That spark which then got infused in each of us, which then during the Kabbalistic period, that whole notion of the Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels, and the sparks are out there. Now our job is to pick up those little sparks and gather them together. But we got to stop thinking about it, I think, at least for me, not just here, and not just Jewish community. Now let's spread that out and share that Torah, share that teaching, so that we can go back to a fire that's not destructive, right? A passion that builds and warms and helps all the people of the world, of the planet, heal ourselves and heal the world itself by virtue of our being interconnected.
We're gonna have to let people go. I know we can keep doing this all afternoon, and I would love nothing more. But we will thank everybody for joining us. To be continued next week. Not necessarily this exact conversation, but Carnie will be leading us in a discussion next week. So you all know that it's going to be incredibly moving and wonderful.
I completely changed what I'm going to do now, so it's okay.
There you go. This is why you shouldn't prepare too far in advance, because it's like I never understand those people who tell me they wrote their Rosh Hashanah sermons like in June. Like, you don't know what the world's going to look like in September. How can you write it in? So I don't trust any of those.
I already finished my Yom Kippur speech. What are you talking about?
I thought that was your Yom Kippur speech.
Last year.
I thought you just gave what. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. To be continued next week, and we look forward to not quite seeing you, but sensing your presence then. Thank you all for being with us.
Someday we're going to do this live and in person, and we're going to get to see all these beautiful Shana faces that we're missing, and hear their passion.
Or we'll do it live in person and no one will show up because they
show up.
Days on Zoom.
Right.
Weren't you the optimist a moment ago? What's going on with you?
I think pajama pants are always optimistic, personally. But,
Exactly.
You wear pants at all? Wait a second. Let me stand up. No, let me not.
Rori, I'm so glad you quoted Aurora Lee. That's one of my all-time favorite poems.
Beautiful. That was amazing.
It's one of my favorites also, I think.